Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here this evening. And I also just want to say thank you to the University of Cape Town, to the Dean, the Vice-Chancellor for encouraging this debate. The reason I mention that is because the responses to transformation and the capacity for transformation depends very much on where you are. Don't you for one moment believe that these issues are the same in the different university traditions which we inherited in our country. So very quickly then, I want to share 10 theses with you. Why 10? Because I've always done 10 on everything. And run through this very quickly. Number one, I think the first thing I want to argue is that transformation, no matter what you think, and I'm saying this particularly to those of you who are in political formations that want it done tomorrow morning. Transformation is not a straight line. In practice, it is not a straight line. It is difficult, it is messy, it is costly, and it is sometimes life-threatening. Nobody told me, and I don't mean this, say this lightly, nobody told me that I would receive at least once a month a fairly serious death threat from somewhere in the country, and sometimes out of the country. In fact, just 2 days ago, my colleague came to warn me and sort of say there was a discussion about hoe kan ons die rector vergiftig, which is poison, and so on. Now, that might sound funny to you, it's not funny to me, because I think, and I don't think Max gets those kinds of things, at least not that I know of. But that's very different, because when you have a debate in the English liberal universities, the debates tend to be argumentative. In other words, it tends to be public. You know, you would put up something on your admissions policy on the website, you'd get people together in the Jamison Hall or whatever it's called, and there'd be debates. In the Afrikaans press, it's insult after insult after insult. It is extremely personal. Ask Russell Botman, ask Dan Gwadi at Northwest University. Sometimes it will kill you, but it is an extremely vindictive and difficult debate with the, aided and abetted, of course, by the Afrikaans press. And one of your colleagues here is one of those who insults time after time, using her space that she has in one of the Afrikaans newspapers. That does not help the transformation debate at all. And so I want to applaud you for opening these difficult issues and discussing them and debating it around the ideas as opposed to around the personalities. This is very important if this country is going to appreciate what democracy is about. Second thesis, that transformation is not employment equity. This is very important, and I think in various ways both Hetty and Max made that particular point. It is about a much deeper change in institutions that touches students, curriculum, institutional cultures, symbolism, and of course staff. Transformation, if I may just refer to a guy that I've known since I was a young man here on the Cape Flats. He was a former convict. He had a name called Saul, and then they called him Paul for some reason. And what is very, very interesting is in one of his letters, for those of you who follow the Christian scriptures, he refers to transformation via a word that I like, a Greek word for metamorphosis. And so I like the notion of transformation as meaning something qualitative, something that, in his words, is the result of a changing, or what he calls the changing in the renewal of your minds, as opposed to, as Hetty said, changing heads. That is a very different sense. None of us talk about transformation seriously in that way, and we should. Number three, and let me get to some of the more difficult things. I want to argue that the academic standard against which professorial appointments are made has always been compromised. I can easily prove it to you at your university here. I can prove it to you at the University of Pretoria, where I worked. I can certainly prove it to you at the University of the Free State. And so this is important for us to acknowledge, because very often when we talk about black academics as professors, somebody with varying degrees of loudness, would slip in the word standards. And I want to tell you the standards of the historically white universities in South Africa, including UCT, has always been low. Don't let anybody tell you it's always been high. Okay? Don't be misled by... And the only reason we think our standards are high is because we've not been elsewhere. That's the problem. And I've heard it said by some of the eminent professors in this room who work here, and that is true. So South Africans, whether it is, soccer, okay, that's a bad example, or, or academics, we're actually not doing well. You can fool yourself with Scopus and H indices and so on and so forth, but that's not really the measure of greatness of a university. All of us, including this really, really good university called UCT, have a very long way to go in relation to the issue that we so, in a slipshod, use the word standards and so on and so forth. In fact, at my university, when we raised the standards for the professoriate, and this year for the first time we're beginning to see the results of that application, the main impact was on white academics who wanted to become, not on black people, on white academics, because suddenly fewer people got through and fewer people succeeded. And so in all our universities, the standard by which we measure professors is in fact, I think, less than adequate. So don't say standards dropped, okay? Talk about how we can raise standards, especially for the professoriate in all our universities. Number 4, I think we should be honest, particularly those of us who have to work with this every single day. There will not be in the immediate term, by which I mean the next 2 or 3 years, or even in the medium term, by which I mean the next 10 to 15 years, sufficient numbers of black or white professors appointable within South African universities. It's as simple as that. But by professor, I mean scholars. With let me just use the social sciences and humanities as my frame of reference. By top scholars, I mean those who produce scholarly books from reputable publishers, with path-breaking research published in leading journals of the world, with meaningful research, as you just heard, that changes communities, and with innovative teaching that changes minds and inspires action. There aren't many such professors in South Africa. You fool yourself, black or white. And so how do we begin to develop the seriousness around what we call the professor in our country? But number 5, that even when there are opportunities for appointing more black professors, when we have those opportunities, there are a myriad of rules, written and unwritten, that effectively excludes appointable candidates. One such insidious set of rules is, particularly in the English universities, the so-called cultural fit argument. What does that mean? Let's unpack that a little bit. Because you don't have to use the word race. Use the word cultural fit. In the English university, it has to do with inbuilt prejudices that are disguised in the language of sophistication. They even use that word, sophistication. Particular forms of English language fluency, political acquiescence, social agreeability, connections to the British university establishment, and you're already halfway through the door if you studied in Oxford and Cambridge, and knowledge of the cultural grammar of the English Academy. Now, having had the privilege of studying at universities around the world, I can tell you the top professors, particularly those who come from other parts of the world, Asia, Latin America, and so on. In the North American Academy, they're not fluent at all in English. They stumble and mumble and fall over their own feet but they are treasured precisely because of their scholarship rather than because of all these things that don't matter. And I can give you very specific examples, but that would be to expose some good friends. In the Afrikaans universities, it's quite different. There it has to do with competence in Afrikaans and the willingness to embrace the language with enthusiasm. In these universities, the public declaration of allegiance to Afrikaans, especially for vice-chancellors, is the single most important factor in determining inclusion or exclusion as a leader. Those people, like my friend Dan Khwadi, are the canaries in the miner's cage, for those of you who know that metaphor. And what that means is, it is an extremely risky proposition, especially in the historically Afrikaans universities. Number 6, that the most damning evidence of wrongdoing when it comes to staffing transformation is the lack of an effective strategy in all our institutions. So don't talk about the little things we are trying to do, and I'm not even going to tell you about all the little things we are trying to do. The question rather that should be posed is, why is it that after decades of openness in some of our universities, do we still not see the rise to the top of black professors? We have to ask that question, because the issue is not going to go away by tinkering on the edges of this thing. The issue being raised, and this is deeply felt amongst black professors, and here I want to disagree with somebody I admire greatly in Kolela. I don't think we must force this debate to force us back into our little tribal communities, you know, of black associations and so on. I often turn down, without thinking, any invitation from the black accountants or the black lawyers. I really think this country has come out of that nonsense, and we now need to create a South African identity, and more importantly, a global identity against which we recognize ourselves. But how long can we continue? And I have, and Max has been very tolerant of me, but I've often just sort of said, you know, that this university, which I like so much, really just get rid of referencing people in your medical school admissions by what they look like, you know, and their color and all of that. That debate is over. You can't correct a wrong by drawing on the same language, on the same grammar, of the same categories, you know, that apartheid gave us. You just can't do that. And so we have to find another way in which to speak about ourselves and others. But when we have opportunities to recognize talent from elsewhere, and just remember that this university, as with all the others, including my own, have always excluded people because of what they look like, always. And whether it was Archie Mafeje at UCT or Chabani Manganyi at Wits, it has always happened. And I was very grateful when UCT, and I was here the evening with Max's inauguration, apologize for that. But don't for one moment believe that the behaviors that made that possible also disappeared on that evening. It doesn't. And now something else, and I want to especially speak to my colleagues here who are not vice-chancellors. The real difficulties with staffing transformation actually doesn't lie with Max and me and Khethi. It lies in the academic departments. That is where the power resides. Let me tell you something. No vice-chancellor has the energy, the time, and the resourcefulness to fundamentally change the stakes at this level of appointment. I have been amazed at how, despite our best efforts, I would simply get a document to sign off with that was decided, despite policy, despite everything we've said, despite pleading, despite threatening, and here's the document, jammer professor, ons het al reeds die persoon in kennis gestel. Now, of course, I can make a big fuss, and I do, but don't you think for a moment that in a loosely coupled organization like a university, that you actually have all the power. You don't. Vice-chancellors are pretty useless, I can assure you, when it comes to the real power making. So Bongani in medicine has much more power than Max actually, at changing the stakes there, even though the focus is very much on the leaders at the top. Right, this is where some of you are going to probably leave the room. But the breathless pursuit of international rankings among some of our leading universities undermines the long-term goal of building equity and excellence through sustained investments in younger black and women scholars. I have just seen this too often to believe it to be otherwise. The thing we are talking about tonight is simply not the most important priority for some university leaders who want quick reputational gains now, rather than the longer term gains that come through structured, determined, patient investments in black academics. I normally use the analogy from sport, in particular rugby. And as a Blue Bull supporter, I just want to say to you, I will leave the stage if you mention what happened last Saturday. I have shorter memory loss, fortunately. So. But, you know, this is the Asian strategy. You plan for 40, 50 years. You don't just get a black rugby player to run onto the field. You actually plan for this. And the question is not what are you doing now. The question is, are the building blocks being set in place at UCT, at UNISA, at Free State, at Pretoria, so that we don't have this debate again a decade or two from now? And on that question, I don't think the answer is very positive. Number 9, almost done, Sakhela. I want to argue that the inherited cultural and political symbolism that continues to, I thought I must use at least one big word so that I look impressive at least tonight, that continues to plasticize. Man, you'll have to talk to me afterwards about that word. South African universities is still largely unexamined in the quest for symbolic reparation. The front page article a couple of days ago in the New York Times by E. Fairbanks, called The Paradox of Integration, please read it, shows clearly that access in itself does not satisfy in South Africa and in our country the desire of black students for recognition and staff for recognition and inclusion in former white universities. I was puzzled, for example, just puzzled, that the University of Stellenbosch would bury its first black rector out of the D.F. Malan Center without any sense of shame. And I was completely puzzled, and I must say perhaps slightly amused, when the new leadership at Rhodes University rushed to announce that the name of the university would not change. Why? Why can't we talk about these things? Have we really become, I don't know, I must impress my medical colleague here, this sort of moral hardening of the arteries, you know? Have we become so incredibly insensitive? I mean, our students had just opened a debate on renaming their residence, which is called JBM Herzog, and my goodness me, 4 months afterwards, you could swear that we were asking for something unreasonable. But we've got to take on these debates. It is simply unacceptable that a university has a D.F. Malan Center. Don't we understand where this comes from? It is unacceptable that these things are not put up for debate. And then finally, I want to argue that the longer universities take to deeply transform themselves, the more vulnerable we become to state interference in this important project. And when that happens, the academic project and its transformation ambitions will truly be, as they say in my other language, ingedrang. Thank you very much.